Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Foundations.
And this wasn't a request, it was a requirement. But the Nazis weren't the first people to do such a thing to the Jewish people, were they?
No, and most people are completely... They actually think that this yellow identification of the Jews started with Nazis. Not true.
Foundations. Understanding the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. With Robbo Robinson and Mandy Warby.
We've been making our way through a pretty difficult and uncomfortable subject on foundations on the teaching of replacement theology within the church for almost 2,000 years, and how the consequences of that teaching has had catastrophic consequences on the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism has always been present, but we began learning about official anti-Semitic replacement theology from the early 4th century, and today we're going to pick it up from there.
And in case anybody is just listening and haven't heard the first 3 programs so far, let me just tell you what replacement theology is. It is the church doctrine that teaches that God has completely done away with Israel and the Jewish people as the chosen people of God and replaced them with the Gentile church as the new people of God, because the Jewish people, because of their leadership, rejected Jesus as Messiah. Therefore, all the curses, all the judgments belong to the Jews, and all the blessings and the covenants and the promises and all the good stuff all belongs to the Gentile church. This is complete revisionism and reversal of God's promise. It's a denial of God's promises and covenants, and it makes him out to be a liar and untrustworthy. It's dangerous.
Now, if you've missed the first 3 episodes, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to them before you keep up with us here, because it is important that we can understand, I guess, the foundation for it. So we've so far looked at the conditions of the covenants, the promises made by God to Israel, and learned that they were unconditional. We've begun to look at the origins of replacement theology, and last time we learned about Emperor Constantine's letter to the bishops with regard to the dates for celebrating Easter, declaring that it should not coincide with the Hebrew Passover, and that the church was not to have anything to do with or anything in common with the Jews. We also learned about John Chrysostom, who a half century after Constantine was rabidly anti-Semitic and preached this to the church.
Yeah. This history is something most Christians are not aware of. Most Christians I talk to go, I've never heard of any of this before. And upon learning about it, they find it very uncomfortable and disconcerting. They can get a bit defensive about it, but it's part of our history. And it's important that we learn both the good and the bad and return to Scripture so we can be really clear on what God teaches about his people and his relationships with them.
Yeah. Now, during the rule of Adolf Hitler and during the war years, of course, Jews were singled out for identification. Before they were rounded up and then sent to death camps, their shops and businesses were marked with a yellow Star of David, and they were all required to wear a yellow Star of David either as an armband or sewn into their clothing. And this wasn't a request, it was a requirement. But the Nazis weren't the first people to do such a thing to the Jewish people, were they?
No, and most people are completely... They actually think that this yellow identification of the Jews started with Nazis. Not true. Muslim rulers in the 8th century were the first to introduce a badge to identify both Jews and Christians that were living amongst their population. Islam calls Jews and Christians the people of the book. Jews and Christians were allowed to live among the Muslims, but they had to pay a special tax called the jizya tax, and they had to wear an identifying badge as well. Depending on which caliph or Muslim leader that was in power, the designs were different. Sometimes belts or fringes were required to be worn. Between 847 and 861, Jews were forced to wear a patch in the shape of a donkey, and Christians were forced to wear patches in the shape of a pig. In Egypt, in the year I'd
say 1005.
Oh, yeah, okay. In Egypt, in the year 1005, Jews were forced to wear Jews were forced to wear bells on their clothing so they could be both seen and heard. In the Middle Ages, Christians ruled most of Europe and they forced Jews to wear distinguishing clothing or markings. On November 11, 1215, Pope Innocent III at the Fourth Lateran Council decreed that Jews and Muslims were to wear identifying markers or clothing at all times. And this was the final measure taken by the church to inhibit social contact between both Jews and Muslims and Christians, right? Keep them separate. So segregation, basically. And it was issued as Canon 68, and the decree became the basis of the subsequent imposition of the so-called Jewish badge in Christian kingdoms.
Wow. So, of course, this is all happening in mainland Europe over these different years. Had it ever gone any further than that? Like, did it go beyond those borders?
Absolutely. Actually, the segregation and discrimination against Jews was successful all over Europe, but nowhere more so than in England, if you can believe it, where Henry III ordered male Jews to wear a badge on their clothing. In 1275, King Edward I specified that the colour of the badge, what it was and its size, and Jews over the age of 7 were required to wear a special piece of yellow taffeta. It had to be 6 fingers long, 3 wide, and it had to be worn over the left chest on their outer garment.
Wow.
In Spain and in Italian territory, circles of red or yellow felt were worn on the front of their clothing. In French territories, starting in the year 1217, Jews had to wear what was called a rota, and that is circles of red or yellow felt. In German-speaking Europe, Jews had to wear a hat. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the artworks or tapestries from the Middle Ages or not. You see all the people in the cities and, it's like they're telling a story of battles and stuff. And you often see characters in there, people with cone-shaped hats on their heads.
Oh, yeah.
That was what the Jews were. That's identifying a Jewish person.
Wow.
They were forced to wear cones on their heads, a pointed hat. It's just, honestly, I read this stuff, I learn this stuff, and it's just beyond me. But I'm seeing the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, and I'm thinking, we never thought it could have happened then. We would not believe it would be happening again, and yet look what's happening around us. In the year 1500, the hat was stopped, but yellow badges became very common. And then after the French Revolution, the Jews experienced emancipation for a time, and the Jewish badge disappeared, and that is until Hitler rose to power. And that's when the badge in the shape of a Star of David, which wasn't used previously in historical settings, that was invented by the Nazis alone.
Wow. So, they've really faced so much over all these years. I guess really there's only that time between the French Revolution and the time of the rise of the Nazis where Jews had the opportunity to live freely in European societies. And that's when they were able to pursue professions in science, commerce. They became lawyers and doctors. They served the nations that they lived in those, so they really were contributing to their society. They even joined the armed forces. They became teachers, business people, civic leaders, and were active contributing citizens in the countries where they lived throughout the diaspora.
And you know what? They weren't troublemakers. They weren't out fomenting riots. None of that.
No, that's so exactly right. They didn't do any of those things. They didn't teach their children to be treasonous and I guess push back against the people they were living amongst, despite the persecution that they had experienced for centuries. They taught their children to be cautious. That's true, but they really believed with the arrival of the Enlightenment era that the ignorance of rabid anti-Semitism and foolish myths and conspiracy theories would come to an end, and that the future was finally going to look a bit brighter for them.
That's what they hoped for. They actually thought finally humanity, the human race, has reached a level of maturity where it can actually use rational thinking and not be caught up in myths and rubbish, And then World War I broke out. Germany lost the war and suffered international humiliation, had crushing reparations heaped upon them, and they were humiliated. And they needed somebody to blame. And you had this man, Hitler, who was a patriot. Absolutely, he was a patriot. And he was so ashamed of what had happened to his country, he wanted somebody to blame. And he looked around and he saw successful Jewish business people, successful Jewish lawyers, doctors, educators. And he needed somebody to blame. All you guys are doing well and getting rich, and we lost the war, and it's all because of you. And you ferment this, and people want somebody to blame. They want somebody to be responsible for our humiliation and loss. And where does it always land in history? right at the feet of the Jewish people.
Well, we'll need to leave it there for this episode of Foundations, but we're going to continue this series on replacement theology, and next time continue to explore some of this history. It's a pretty disturbing history, and some of the different things that the Jews have had to face at the hands of quote-unquote Christians. So we'll do that next time as we continue this series on Foundation.
This has been Foundations, a look at the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. For study notes, resources and more, see vision.org.au/foundations.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.